Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me with you. Thank you, Emily, for your beautiful introduction. I want to say a word about Yoni Gordis to start. I feel like that's always that's basically where I start every talk, a word about Yoni Gordis. Yoni, who's been my friend for many years, we met for the first time at a bagel place in Jerusalem and kind of fell in love and spent the past many years dreaming and thinking about what change might look like. And I just want to thank you for inspiring me and so many of my colleagues and all of us. Yoni has this prophetic vision and this angelic voice, and we're really so blessed to have you in leadership in our community. Oh, come on. Let's give a little applause to Yoni. I also see that Lynn is here, also with Lisa and Sandy, who I don't know, who may be here. Yes? So I want to thank all three of you, too. It's been many years now, many long years, but at least a decade, that we've been working together, and we're so grateful for your visionary support, and really it's really very powerful and wonderful when the funding world is actually on the side of the innovators. It's very rare, and so we're grateful to you for your vision and for your support. I want to say a word about last night as well. Emily started us off that way this morning, and last night when I got back to my room, I'm teaching at Hartman this week, and started to get news alerts about what was going on in Istanbul, and it feels like the world is convulsing in so much pain right now under the weight of violence that is too often motivated by and justified by a commitment to or connection to God. And I was thinking last night about these words that David Ellenson likes to say. He says, how do you know if it's the voice of God that's speaking in your ear? Well, if it tells you to kill other people, it's not the voice of God. And I was just thinking about what it means to be in this kind of conversation about building a different sort of way of embracing our inheritance, our past, and grabbing hold of the future in a way that actually affirms human dignity and love in a world that's in so much pain. So I'm really grateful that we get to have this opportunity to be together precisely because of what happened last night and the fact that this keeps happening more and more. There was actually a Pew study that came out just a few days ago on religion and violence globally, and it is absolutely on the rise. They looked at 200 countries and found that religious violence is no longer anomalous. It's really normative now, and it's a very scary time that we're in. And so I'm grateful that there's an opportunity to really speak honestly and openly about human suffering, about the capacity for love and connectedness to bring us together in a very fraught time. So I want to start by sharing with you that in the spring of 2004. I read a book by Jonathan Sacks, the former chief rabbi of Great Britain, called The Dignity of Difference. It just came out that year. If you haven't read it, you have to read the hardcover version because it was later censored, and they took out all the best parts, as they always do when they censor, because that's the point of censorship. And one of the book is incredible, but one of the passages that just sat in me and was gnawing away at me is when he draws two images of the world in the year 2020. And he essentially argues that there are two different paths that humanity could go down. He said it could be the beginning of a new golden age. We could finally figure out how to harness our incredible intellect, our spiritual power, our connectivity, and we could make sure that every child in every poor country in the world has access to medical care, laptops, through the internet is able to get access to information, sees how big and how broad the world is. Through a series of really courageous steps taken by change makers, we're able to achieve peace in the Middle East. He says, imagine what might be possible if we could actually harness all of our resources for good and enter a new golden age by the year 2020. And then he says, the world in the year 2020. New York has just been hit by another dirty bomb. He says, bombs in train stations and buses in Madrid and in London and Paris have essentially made it that people are scared to leave their homes. Plane hijackings have made it so that air travel is essentially at a standstill. And he said, despite all of our technological advances, people live in a constant state of terror. He said, the entire Middle East is essentially driven by a set of corrupt religious fanatics. We could be entering the beginning of a new dark age. He wrote this in 2004. And what's terrifying now is that many of his predictions, including those of global economic collapse, hadn't happened yet, but were to come to pass in the next few years. And at the time, I had just given birth to my first child. She was about 6 months old. And I read this piece, and my hands were shaking. And I remember walking over to her crib and just staring at this tiny child, thinking she's going to be 16 years old in 2020. She should be thinking about applying to college. What kind of world is she going to be living in? Is it going to be a new golden age, or is it going to be a new dark age? And Sachs writes that each of these two scenarios is equally possible. And what's at stake between them is what each of us is willing to do about it. For me, this was the motivational kick in the butt that I needed to actually start to do something, to start to organize. Because I realized at that point, having moved to Los Angeles from New York, that many of the most interesting, creative, and smartest young Jews that I came in contact with, and there are many of them in Los Angeles, were completely disconnected from Jewish religious life and from Jewish communal life. And I realized that if we were going to do anything to try to shift the tide of history from the new dark age to the new golden age, we would have to do it together. And we would have to do it strengthened by the force of our tradition, building a new iteration of what Jewish community could actually look like, and building new bonds and connections with people of other faiths. Because the only way to do justice today, I believe, is to do it multi-faith. And so we set out to build a community that we hoped would activate, would set a spark, and would start to make people ask questions about what is our inheritance and what are we actually doing about it. So that was 12 years ago now. And I want to share with you a little bit of some of what I've learned about how to make social change and how not to make social change over the course of those couple of years. And we'll close with a little bit of a word on risk. So if you take your study sheets, your text, we're going to do this as a text study. So this is not a lecture. I need your voices here as well. So what I want to walk us through, by the way, it's called Running Naked Through the Street because I taught at Limmud London in the winter. Some version of this. Have any of you been to Limmud London? So what I didn't know is that people basically choose what sessions to go to on two factors. One, if there's some famous teacher that you've heard of and everybody says, oh my God, you have to go hear that guy. Two, if there's a really sexy title. So my title originally was something like Failed and Successful Models of Leadership in Traditional Jewish whatever. And, so nobody came to that session. And then I changed it to Running Naked Through the Streets, and everybody showed up. So it was packed. So I learned my lesson. So let's start at the beginning. I want to walk us through this. And I think since I am mic'd, I'll take us through the text, but I would love to hear your thoughts as we go. So the first text comes from Tanhuma and is a midrash on Noach. So I'm assuming that there is a wide range of learning here in this room. If I say anything or if anybody says anything that's not clear, please interrupt and we'll together engage. So it says the following: come and see. Why did the Holy One command Noach to make the ark? So by the way, why did the Holy One command Noach to make the ark? Don't look, just think. But can you be bold? Yeah. To save himself and his family, right? That's what we learned. So God is fed up with humanity. God wants to destroy the world and finds this guy who's a tzaddik in his own time, maybe wouldn't be in our time, but he's decent, and God wants to save him, and God wants to save his family. So God tells him to go build an ark and to take 2 of every animal and to take his family and put them on the ark. That's the story we've all learned, yes? Okay, so look what the Midrash does. So why did the Holy One command Noach to make the ark? In order that humankind would see him engaged in its construction and repent of their ways. Totally different take from what most of us have learned. So the question, how did the rabbis get here? They say, couldn't the Holy One have saved him by divine fiat? God is God. God could have said, I want to destroy the world, but save you. So why send him on some big construction building project? Instead, lift up this man, his wife, who the Torah did not have the time to name, sadly, even though a couple of weeks ago we had a parsha where the Torah listed the gifts of the 12 tribes, and they're all exactly the same, and we get the full list 12 times, but not enough room to name Eshet Noach's wife, another story. And so why didn't God just lift them up and bring them to safety while the world was destroyed? But God said, instead of doing that, I will say to him, make an ark of gopher wood, and he will engage in the work and cut the wood, and everyone will gather around him and say, Noach, what are you doing? And Noach will say, I'm building an ark because God's going to bring a flood upon the earth. And when they hear that, they will listen and they will repent. So pause there for a moment, and I want to ask you to think about what theory of social change is at play in this midrash. What is God's idea of how change is made? By force of example, yes? Okay, so the idea is, it's actually street theater, right? Someone will do something dramatic and big. Other people will see it, they'll notice it, they'll be startled by it, and they'll ask about it, and that way, Noach will be able to get his message out. It doesn't say stand on the street corner and preach to people. It says do something utterly outrageous. So did you remember reading a couple of years ago, there was some Dutch guy who built an actual replica of the ark, and it's massive. It was a massive project, a huge construction project. And the rabbis say it took around 120 years for Noach to build this. So for 120 years, this guy is building an ark on dry land in front of his house, okay? And the idea is that enough people will walk by and say, what is my neighbor doing? That then it will spark a conversation, and he will be able to change the way that they behave by scaring them into what will happen if they don't change. But there's a problem, which is, lo hayu mashkichin alav. God imagined that this is what would happen, but they didn't even notice him. They did not even notice Noach or what Noach was doing. And so instead, what happens? After all of those years and all that effort, the world is ultimately destroyed. So what went wrong here? This is a failed model, clearly. What went wrong in this place? The assumption that people would notice and that they would change based on what they notice, right? So Gadi argues that the mistake here is God's, right? God had the wrong change theory. God thought, I'm going to do something big and dramatic, people will notice, and it will change the way that they live. Any other ideas of who might have failed here? Yes? Okay. Great. Okay, so Netta puts the locus of blame here, not on God, but on Noach, saying it's his failed leadership, not God's bad idea. His failed leadership is what it did. It was an externalized, imposed idea that came from God. He didn't actually, this is like a donor-driven project, right? I'm doing this because someone said they give me a lot of money to do it. It doesn't actually align with my own objectives for the organization, but I've got this offer for all this money, so what am I going to do? And so Netta would argue that that's basically a recipe for failure, because if you don't believe in it, if it doesn't come from the inside, you're not going to pursue it the way that you need to pursue it in order to be successful. Yeah. Okay, right. So in some way, perhaps even the most persuasive leader would not have been able to turn this generation, right? If this is a generation of people who are willfully blind, there might be nothing that he could have done in order to change them. So now we have Gadi says that the failure is God's. Netta says that the failure is Noach's. And your name? Gabriella says, actually, the failure is the people. It's not a bad idea, and it's not even bad leadership. It's that the people really don't want it. They're not willing to hear it, right? So you can bang your head against the wall, but this generation is simply not ready for that message. Yes. Okay, tell me your name. Right, so I don't know if people could hear Noah, but Noah says that maybe Noah's project was just to create the opportunity for people so that if they wanted it, they could have chosen it. It's like there's an escalator, there's an elevator, and there are stairs. Pick your path, right? This one takes you to redemption. This one's going to take you to drowning and death. They chose drowning and death. So maybe it wasn't a failure. Maybe there just weren't people who were decent enough to actually have this kind of transformation. One more comment. Yes?
Discussion with God between Yonah and God and
right.
Noach and God.
Right. So, and the difference between Yonah and Noach is that when Yonah is asked by God to do something, he flees. He does not want to be the messenger.
Right.
When Noach is asked by God to do something, even something truly horrible, he does not protest. He says, how big should the walls be and should I have windows? Right? And so these are very different models of leadership. Okay, I'm going to push on for a moment. So perhaps the failure is that it was a bad idea. Perhaps the failure is that this wasn't the right leader who could do it. And it is said of Noach, Levi Yitzchak Berdichev says actually of Noach, that there are two kinds of tzaddikim in the world. There are two kinds of righteous people. Have you heard this, Torah? So powerful. Like Noach was a tzaddik. He was righteous, but there are different kinds of righteous. There are tzaddikim who, when they're cold, put on a fur coat because they're cold. And then there are tzaddikim who, when they're cold, build a fire because they assume if I'm cold, other people must be cold too. And so maybe he wasn't the right kind of righteous person. He was okay, but he wasn't the right person who could save this generation. And others say maybe actually the failure was of the generation. And there was nothing that could have saved or transformed this generation. Yeah? Okay, no, that's okay. Great. And so I think what you bring us to is this wasn't the right model of organizing, right? Anybody who's ever gotten anything done in the world had to have partners. And there's this mythology of the sole entrepreneur, risk taker who transforms the way that the world thinks about or looks at something. But actually, real social change happens in partnership. It happens collaboratively. It happens when people work together and different people bring their different talents and gifts, and then they're able to put out a transformative message. So even John Lennon did not work alone, right? People who do great things in the world, even great artists, often have people who they're engaged in dialogue with in order to be great. And Noah himself it seems like he did not even engage his wife on this, right? He was a solo operator. And so it could be that he did not organize properly. I remember, by the way, when I went to my first board meeting that went sour early on in IKAR's development, and I called afterwards my friend, Daniel Sokach, who some of you might know. He runs the New Israel Fund now. At the time, he was a dear friend and a board member, and I called him afterwards when we were driving home. I said, I did not see that coming. I can't believe that I didn't get what I wanted in this board meeting. And he said, well, who did you talk to before the meeting? I said, what do you mean? I just talked to you. He said, no. If you have an important idea and you want to bring it to your board and you really want it to be, you want to get the green light, you need to organize. You have to call people beforehand and say, this is my idea. I'd love to get you on board. I want you to be a stakeholder. If you go out there and build an ark on your front lawn, it's very possible that everybody drowns, okay? So let's look very quickly at a second model. This is where the running naked through the streets come. We're going to turn to Isaiah, chapter 20. I don't know if you knew this about Isaiah. I think this is absolutely the most interesting fun fact about Isaiah. God spoke to Isaiah, son of Amos, saying, go, take the clothes off your body, take the shoes off your feet. And Isaiah did. He got naked and barefoot. And God said to him, just as my servant Isaiah walked naked and barefoot for 3 years, let it be a sign and a wonder upon Egypt and Ethiopia. God was trying to send a message about sin and destruction that would inevitably come unless people changed their way. The ark did not work. So God tried a different path with Isaiah. Instead, God said, you go out and talk to the people. But the people didn't notice Isaiah, just the same way that they didn't notice most of the other prophets, which we'll get to in a moment. So God said, okay, get naked. People notice naked people, right? Unless you live in San Francisco, where they're all over the place, and then you barely notice anymore. Here's this naked guy who's running up and down the street screaming, people, Stop sinning. Pay attention. Something's going to happen here. And they don't even see him. They don't even notice. Have you seen or heard that person in our political space who's sounding the alarm? Maybe he's a street preacher. Maybe he's or she is preaching in a shul. Maybe it's someone who's not preaching at all. Maybe it's Samantha Bee, right? Who's saying, my God, do you see what's happening? And nobody seems to be listening. Maybe it's Stav Shafir, right? So for all of us, we know that these people exist, and yet they can scream until they have no voice left. Nobody's paying attention to them. Were you going to say something? Yes. Okay. So Dan, what? Yeah, laser eyes here. That's the power of the technology of the lens. Okay, so Dan says he's a decent guy, he claims. You guys can attest to that or, contradict that. So Dan is a decent guy, but if someone built an ark on their front lawn or came running through the streets naked, Dan would close his door to that guy. Dan would not say, tell me your Torah. Let me hear about how I can be more decent in the world. I'm already decent. That person seems crazy. And that might ultimately be the failure of street theater to bring about real social change. And if we look for a moment to Abraham Joshua Heschel, he basically guides us through the failures of most of our great prophets, all of whom tried some version of what Isaiah did, and most of whom actually failed. So if you haven't read the prophets, at least read the introduction to this book, which is exceptional. And what Heschel writes is that the prophet's word is like a scream in the night. The world is at ease. The world is asleep, and the prophet feels the blast from heaven. The prophet feels it in her bones. In his body, he feels it. And he cannot effectively communicate to people what he actually sees. He says to be a prophet is both a distinction and an affliction. Other people hate him, and he hates himself even more, right? He does not like doing what he's doing. There are many other ways to make a living, and yet he feels in his bones that something is terribly and profoundly wrong in the world. In other words, he sees that after Sandy Hook, after a mass shooting of children in a classroom, we cannot pass basic gun laws in the United States, and he cannot sleep at night. And he wonders, how long are we going to live with this kind of insanity and absurdity masquerading as decent public discourse? People are dying, 35,000 people a year in the United States. How long will we continue to live by the myth of our own powerlessness? That's what the prophet feels. Everyone else is like, okay, enough already, let's watch Game of Thrones, right? Do you see the difference? Because I remember reading many years ago, there was a sign up in a window in San Francisco. It said very simply, it was during the war in Iraq, early years, where's the outrage? And Bob Herbert wrote a piece in the New York Times in which he said that more than 75% of Americans were opposed to the war in Iraq. And he said, and nevertheless, the war persists because it's very difficult to muster the kind of outrage you need for social change when you could just as easily kick back on the couch with a beer and watch American Idol. And it's absolutely true. No matter how deeply some people feel it, sometimes that feeling is not able to be communicated to the masses until it's too late. This is the prophetic story. The failure of these men to actually speak to the people in a way that they can hear it. That's model number one. Someone who feels and maybe even feels fiercely, but is absolutely fundamentally incapable of translating that message to make social change. Go back for a moment to Jonathan Sacks. If we are in fact standing on the precipice of either a new golden age or a new dark age, we know and understand what's at stake. And some of us have real moments of clarity where we think, my God, I see what direction we could be moving in here. We've got to do something now. If we don't figure out how to effectively bring about that kind of transformation, so then maybe the very best we'll be able to do at the end of the day is say, well, I tried. Nobody decided to get on the boat. So, okay, the world is going to sink now. So now I want to look at a slightly better model, and then I'm gonna leave us with what I think is in my estimation, perhaps the only way to make real and sustainable change. Don't read ahead. So, okay, so let's look for a minute at 1 Kings. So a little bit of background to the story of Elijah. So this is in the time of the kingdom of Israel. This is under King Ahab and his wife, Queen Jezebel. The people of Israel had turned to worship idols. They were worshiping Baal and Asherah, and the king and queen decided that they will persecute anybody who was loyal to God in this time. And so Elijah is one of the remaining prophets who stays loyal to God. And what ends up happening is that there's a kind of prophet face-off between the prophets of Baal and Asherah and Elijah, the prophet who still stands for God. So what happens is they go to Mount Carmel, just a little bit northwest of where we are now, and they have 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah on one side, and they have Elijah on the other side. And all the people of Israel are gathered around, and they're going to determine which path they should follow, the path of idolatry or a path back to God. And so what they're called to do is bring a sacrifice and see which God will awaken to this sacrifice. First, by the way, Elijah comes to all of the people and says to them, how long will you hobble between two opinions? If the Lord is God, so follow God. If Baal is God, follow that guy if you want. And the people don't speak at all. And this is what sparks. So first he starts with logic and reason. He fails to convince them that way. So they have to turn to something else. Well, the prophets of Baal and Asherah go first. And they create this sacrifice. And they wait for their gods to come down and devour the sacrifice in fire. But nobody comes. And so they wait and they wait and wait, and nobody responds. And they start cutting themselves. They're bleeding. They start dancing. They're trying to awaken the gods. And Elijah starts mocking them, saying, oh, it looks like your gods are taking a nap. Maybe they're on vacation, right? I don't know where your gods went. And then Elijah creates his own sacrifice after the failed offering to Baal and Asherah. So Elijah offers his own sacrifice. And the Spirit, the power, the presence of God comes down in a great and holy fire and consumes the sacrifice. Look at verse 38. The fire of the Lord fell, and it consumed the burnt sacrifice, the wood pile, and the stone, and the dust. Everything is swept up by the power of God. It even licked up the water that was in the ditch. They built a ditch around to make sure that, the wildfires that happen in the north, that one of those didn't accidentally take the sacrifice. It even consumed that. And when the people saw it, were they convinced? Yes, they were convinced, right? They fell on their faces and they said, the Lord is God, the Lord is God. So here for the first time, we have a model of successful leadership on some level. He tries to convince them with words, nothing's working. He turns to miracle. And when they see it, it's huge and it's undeniable. And the people are utterly convinced and they say, okay, I get it. I'm on board. Here's the problem with that model too, though. How long do you think that lasts? Right, until the next wildfire starts and takes the bowl that someone offers at the next tree, right? Yes? Right. 3 days later, right? Yeah, what's your name? Paula. I don't know if you can all hear each other, but your name? Emil says, first of all, this miracle lasts until the next miracle happens, or apparent miracle happens, right? We are not convinced by miracles. It doesn't work. In the moment, in the instant, we're completely captivated, right? And then the lights go on in the bar, right? And it's closing time, and you're like, whoa, okay, I'll call you, right? It's like it fades very, very quickly. And so Paula says that this has happened in other points in Jewish history, most famously after the splitting of the sea. And if you look down to text number 5, from the book of Exodus, from Shemot. So this is the perfect example of when it happens. Moses, after these people, this generation that left Egypt, witnessed the most extraordinary miracles that any generation would ever witness, the 10 plagues, and then the splitting of the sea. And they're out in the wilderness, and 3 days later, these people are fetching to Moses, saying, "Why did you take us out of Egypt? To die in the wilderness? What are we supposed to drink?" So even the great miracles do not transform the way that we think and do not transform the way that we feel in the long term. Yes? So Nina says that the problem here is that, again, this is all externally imposed, right? It's like Netta says before, this comes from the outside, that the people are not a part of their own transformation. I have to just tell you one thing, which is very early on, about 6 months into the beginning of our community, so there was a family foundation that became very interested in our work and said, "You can't have a community without a building. We have to make you a building." And space is a huge challenge in Los Angeles, where basically it costs $12 million to buy a warehouse that's this size so you can knock it down and try to build something. You know, we have a community of hundreds of people coming every week. We don't have the space for it. 6 months in, someone said, "We're going to do this for you." And we entered into this conversation about what our dream space would look like and which architect we should work with and who we would bring in to partner and collaborate. Eventually, like many good things that come too easily, the family decided to go in a different direction after we spent about a year building plans. And I have to tell you, my first thought when it happened, even though now, 12 years later, I would feel slightly differently about it, was relief. Because I knew that if someone swept in 6 months into the beginning of a new idea and offered us absolutely everything, we were never going to become ourselves, right? We had to first struggle and fight and push. This kind of miracle in the very beginning of our community's existence would have absolutely stalled us out. It would have been the greatest obstacle to our growth. Now, if someone comes and offers me a building, I will take it. Because we know who we are now. We know who we are. We've done the hard work. So, but I want to say that I think that Nina's right. If you don't actually work for your miracle, then very quickly you lose interest and you move on and it doesn't stick. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Elijah. I want to offer for you an alternative model. So look for a moment, and then we're going to talk about risk as we close. Are we done? Yeah. We're okay? A few minutes? Okay. So, but I have to share this with you. So I have this idea about Megillat Esther, the book of Esther. If you can go down to text 6 here. I never noticed this before. Have read the book of Esther many times. I know many of you have read this many times. It's in the 9th chapter, which may be why I never noticed it before. Maybe by the time you get to the 9th chapter, if you're doing your work on Purim, you're not in exactly a condition to take in a deep chiddush, deep awareness of the text. But I want to just share with you something that is absolutely extraordinary that happens in the 9th chapter, which I believe offers for us a very different model of what it might look like, in contrast to the model of Noah, the model of Isaiah, and so many of the prophets who tried the big dramatic street theater, and the model of miracle, something extraordinary but also externally imposed that convinces you for about 10 minutes and then you lose interest. Instead, I want to just offer for us the model of Mordechai. So here's what happens, just to remind you a little bit of the backstory. So Haman determines that he's declares a genocide against the Jewish people. In the last moment, through a combination of human-created miracles and perhaps some kind of quiet divine intervention, the people are saved. And while they had been slated for extermination, instead they now triumph over their enemies. And they have this feeling of incredible relief because they know how close they were to the edge of the abyss. And something incredible happens. The people turn to one another. If you look at verse 19 for a moment, the Jews of the villages who lived in unwalled towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a day of gladness and feasting and a holiday and a day of sending portions to one another, mishloach manot. Okay, so they basically do two things in the face of the miracle of their survival, which they did not expect to have coming. They do two things. Number one, they get together and they have a big celebration with each other. And number two, they send each other little packages of cookies and little tangerines and little bottles of grape juice, right? They send each other little treats of love, mishloach manot. Why do they do that? Because in the face of their unexpected survival, the people they feel this need to establish and reaffirm the bonds of connectivity between themselves and other people. And so they reach out to other people who maybe they haven't seen on the other side of Shushan. It's been too long, right? We should have dinner sometime. I'm really glad that you're alive. We made it, right? We could have died, but we survived. And their natural human instinct is twofold: to celebrate and to reconnect with each other, okay? Now, look at the stroke of genius that comes from Mordecai in verse 20. So Mordecai wrote these things down, and he sent letters to all the Jews that were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, to enjoin them that they should keep the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same yearly. What is the first great leadership step that Mordecai has taken here? He wrote it down, right? He said, you are right. Your instinct is right. This is an extraordinary moment. Let's make sure that this moment lasts. Let's write it down, and let's make sure that it's not just this year, but it's next year at this time, and the year after that at this time, and the year after that. And perhaps because he did that, when do we today celebrate the memory of this extraordinary story? Exactly on that same day, 2,300 years later. Yeah. So now, Tammy, hold your thought for 1 second. So he says, let us write this down on the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day, these days wherein the Jews had rest from their enemies, the day that we survived, and the month that was turned from sorrow to gladness, from mourning to Yom Tov. This is the v'nafochu, the whole message of Purim, which is not a child's holiday. It's not. I love celebrating Purim with my kids. I love getting them all dressed up. This is a grown-up holiday, because this holiday says every one of us stands on the edge of the abyss. We could be dead tomorrow, right? We have no idea. In an instant, life changes from mourning, from sorrow to celebration. Everything's great in your life. Then you accidentally pick up the phone and read a text message that wasn't intended for you, and everything falls apart, right? You're doing just fine, and all of a sudden you end up at the wrong airport, in the wrong terminal, in the wrong moment, and it's the worst day of everybody's life. Life can change in an instant. So what are you doing about it right now? So first, he writes it down. Second, he reinforces what the message is, why it matters. It's not just we survived, let's celebrate. It's we survived and we stand on the edge of the abyss now and always. What does it mean to hold life with this kind of preciousness? And then he says, what should you do on the 14th day of Adar? Make these days of feasting and gladness, and sending portions to one another, mishloach manot, and matanot levionim, gifts to the poor. Now, as Tammy says, the power and the magnificence of Mordecai as a leader is that he meets the people exactly where they are. And he says, you're right, we should celebrate. We should have days of feasting and gladness, and we should send mishloach manot. What a great idea, says Mordecai. I wouldn't have thought of that myself. Right? We should do all these great things that you're saying that we should do, that you know what you need to do in order to celebrate. But that is not enough. And do you see the sleight of hand here? You see Mordecai's sleight of hand? Matanot levionim. All of a sudden, it's about the poor? When did this become about the poor? The Jews, in their natural instinct, had feasting and celebration and sent little gifts to each other. And all of a sudden, Mordecai says, great, 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 do that. And also, take care of the vulnerable today. Do you know why? Because tomorrow, it could be you, right? In an instant, everything might change, and you're the guy who's on the street, who's asking for support, who everyone averts their eyes as they walk by. You didn't survive for nothing, says Mordecai. So go out and do something with your good fortune right now to help turn someone else's fortune around. And in fact, on Purim, you're not supposed to say no to anybody. We have an affirmative obligation to give to at least 2 people, right? But anybody who you see who's in need on that day, no judgment, no calculation, you just give. Why? Because it could be you tomorrow. And it could have been you yesterday, and the reason you were saved is to carry this message forward. And the reason we mark the 14th of Adar every single year is in order to say, we need to remember this message. This is one worth remembering. I want to hold up the model of Mordechai as a counter example to these other versions of failed leadership that we saw before. There are so many great and worthy efforts that happen in the Jewish community, in Israel, in the United States, and around the world, right? So many. And we pour millions and millions of dollars into these really great efforts, and most of them fail. Most great efforts at social change fail because we don't have an effective model of social change. I want to invite us to really think about what we noticed that went wrong in so many of these cases and what I argue went right in the case of Mordechai and in the case of Beruah, who, our only female example. This is the way the world works. There's only 2 minutes left now. And I know we want to have questions. But I can tell you that Beruah, on one foot, the wife of Rabbi Meir, essentially does exactly the same thing that Mordechai does. She figures out what the system is that she functions in, and then she stretches the boundaries of that system. So she operates as a radical, as a transformative actor, but from within, pushing out the boundaries to discover what might actually be possible in this space that we hold. She does not take what is as what ought to be. She comes with a different vision, with a different sense of what might actually be possible. And she knows that she's stretching the boundaries beyond what they've ever been stretched to before, and yet she declares that's the only kind of world that I want to live in, because that's my vision of what might be possible. I want to live in a world where human beings can change and transform and be transformed, not in a world that's much more absolutist, where you are defined by your worst behavior. And she knows that our tradition could argue either way, that you could read the text to be fundamentalist, or you could read the text to be expansive. And she says, I am pushing out the boundaries from within to make space for a different kind of vision of what's possible in this community than there was ever space before. I want to hold out these models of Beruah and of Mordechai as two leaders who are able to show us ways that we might bring about a kind of transformation. And I'm going to close by just sharing with you a word about risk, which I'm sure you'll hear many things throughout the rest of this day, which will in some ways echo or maybe contradict what I'm about to say. With all of this as the context, one of the elements of risk theory is that the pain of losing is twice as powerful an emotional experience as the potential pleasure from gaining, okay? So when I was in my first year of college, Khalid Muhammad from the Nation of Islam came to speak on my campus. And the Jews went crazy. Now, this guy was an avowed anti-Semite, and he came to talk about the death of Malcolm X, which I was very interested in because he came from the Nation of Islam, and Malcolm X sort of predicted in his autobiography that he would be killed by the Nation of Islam, and I was curious what this guy would say, and so I went. I walked in, and there were about 1,000 Jews, students, graduate students and undergrad students, standing outside the plaza. Thank you. I got it. Oh, it just says that for me. So I walk in, and there are 1,000 Jews protesting. And I went inside, and I heard the guy, and he was, in fact, quite anti-Semitic. And I will never, it was searing. It was searing and painful, and I ultimately walked out. But a couple days later, we get a notice in the mailbox of every Jew who had a Jewish-sounding name at Columbia, which I apparently did not have, but many of my friends did. So the letter says, why is it the case that when an anti-Semite comes to campus, 1,000 people come out to rally, and yet when it was Simchat Torah last week, we had 3 Jews and a Torah on the steps of campus? Where are the Jews? Why do we only show up when there's a risk of losing, when there's a challenge or a threat from the outside? What do we believe in? Who are we, and what is actually worth fighting for? So what I want to leave us with is, ultimately the change that we want to make in this room full of change agents and dreamers and prophets, is our change about trying not to lose, or is our change actually about trying to gain? Is it actually about believing that there's a different way to be a Jew in the world? That there's a different way to be a human being in the world? That our tradition might help inform a very different way of engaging humankind? Because even though we're willing to take greater risks not to lose, I would suggest that if we apply the same kind of hunger for an ability to jump across the abyss and take risk when we're not only trying not to lose people, but actually trying to bring people into a conversation and share a vision of what's different and what's possible, I think we might have an extraordinary future before us. So I want to thank all of you so much, and I will tell you, if you're ever in Los Angeles, I would absolutely love to have you come to my community and celebrate Shabbat with us at IKAR. I'm so grateful to all of you for learning together today. Thank you.
So now we're going to take 10 minutes for questions. So as we've done every day, if you want to line up at the microphones, and we can...
Hi.
Thank you for a moving lesson. I'll exercise my risk-taking and say something about both Elijah and Mordecai. And there's something similar between these two stories. Moving from sorrow to a celebration, what does these two leaders do? They slaughter someone else. Elijah slaughters hundreds of people. Mordecai slaughters thousands of people. It wasn't focused in your lesson, but it's down there in the text. So I would say their vision of what is a social change is killing whoever does not believe with you. This is very similar to what just happened yesterday in Istanbul. So I would say that this is a risk in following these kinds of leaders. Hopefully we could be inclusive and not move from sorrow to celebration by killing others.
Yeah, thank you, Aris, for saying that. And I hear what you're saying. I hope we can learn from Mordecai nevertheless and apply some of the lessons and messages. I know that you met with Micha Goodman yesterday, who's a good friend of mine, and I think one of the exceptional, outstanding teachers of Torah in the world alive today. And I remember hearing a shiur from Micha many years ago that where he looked at Isaiah and Ezekiel, who both have a vision of the end of days, and they're actually parallel visions between these two prophets, where the people of Israel have been scattered throughout the world, and then the people of Israel come back together. There's an ingathering of the exiles. And in Ezekiel, what happens in the final act is a massacre, where once they come back and gather in this place, the Israelites or the Jews are able to conquer the enemy, and blood is flowing down the streets, and we are victorious. And Isaiah has exactly the same setup, the ingathering of the exiles, but in the final act, instead of a slaughter, the word of God is proclaimed, and the people's hearts are opened up, and we stand together in peace. And I think that there are really two different visions of the way to affect change in the world, and really what our ultimate dream is. And what I think is so powerful about Micha is he says that this is a machloket nevi'im. The prophets are arguing with each other about what our ultimate dream is. Is our dream to conquer the enemy? Is our dream to actually make peace? And they're both contained in our canon. They're both in the Tanakh. And we as Jews today have to determine what's our dream. What's the kind of world that we want to live in? Do we want to see social change happen because we win? Or do we want to see social change happen because we change the way that the world looks and the ideas about what it means to live together in the world? So thank you so much for your point. Very important.
Hi.
Hi.
You have to forgive me because I've sort of lost my voice. My name is Jenna, and I think that might have tied into answering my question, but I was following the logic of what the examples you were giving, but I was just thinking that in the example of Mordecai, like what the people did for themselves seems a lot easier in the sense that it was like a celebration. You know, it's like a lot easier to do something that's festive and positive than the earlier examples where it's a lot harder. So I was just curious how you would answer that.
So if what we're asking of the people is that they come to free pizza parties at the Hillel, so you're right, then we're not asking a lot of them, right? But if what we're asking of them is that they transform their heart with a message of possibility, which is ultimately Mordecai's goal, right? He's not only interested in the feast, he's interested in the feast because of the perpetuation of the idea. From sorrow to celebration, your life could change in an instant. So if what we're trying to do is we're using the pizza as a way to change people's lives, then absolutely, right? Birthright's not about a free 10-day trip to Israel. Birthright is about changing the way that people understand their own identity and their relationship with Israel and starting to take themselves more seriously as actors in the Jewish community and in the world. And so if ultimately, what are we ultimately asking of people? And I don't believe Mordechai was just asking them to have a party. I think Mordechai was trying to bring about a revolution in the way that Jews think about our survival. We survived, yes, but what are we here for, right? What do we do now with our survival? What makes us worthy of our survival? I'm going to go back for one moment to the previous comment to just say we didn't spend time with Rabbi Meir and Beruria, but actually it's a great counter-testimony because it's Rabbi Meir who has a fantasy of a violent end. So on one foot, very, very quickly, the basic story is that Rabbi Meir, one of the great rabbis, he lives in a bad neighborhood. And there are these guys, these biryone, they're gang members. They harass him. They tackle him on the street. You can imagine it must be very bad because Rabbi Meir prays that they should die. And he's Rabbi Meir, right? He prays that they should die. And Beruria, his wife, who was exceptional and extraordinary, Beruria hears him and says, why are you doing that? Because you can justify from some pasuk in Tanakh that it says that the sinner should die? You could just as easily read it as that the sin should die. Why do you say chotim instead of chataim? There are no vowels in our text. You can choose to read the text differently if you want to live in a different kind of world. We can read boundaries as exclusive or as inclusive, right? We can broaden the boundaries of the conversation if we so choose. It's well within our right. Beruria doesn't say, I don't want to be part of a religious tradition where people can read that other people are sinners and sinners should die. She says, let's expand our tradition and make room for a different way of engaging in the world. This is a kind of counter-testimony to the others, as you point out, because this is saying, instead of turning to violence, why don't we instead turn toward love? And I believe an equally effective or perhaps more effective way of engaging. One more question. I'm sorry, you've been waiting, Beth.
Yeah, my name is Beth, and I don't know if I've clearly articulated a question, but I've been thinking after yesterday and the past few weeks of leadership instilled by fear and the actions that have been taken based on fear and how people are responding because of that. And particularly with this theme of risk, risk is only risk if there is fear involved. And so this other piece of we live in the world today where there's constant fear of the climate change, the world is going to come to an end, and I don't think this is something new. This has been, there's the world coming to an end, I think is why society has come together in the way it does. But how do we know what to actually be fearful of? How as leaders do you inspire the right kind of fear? And how do we think of that as the fear coming from the fear of God, or even to know what's really should be afraid of?
Wow. So on one foot, I think it's an excellent question. And I know that you heard from Micha about the fear versus humiliation paradigm, which I think is a very powerful way of understanding the conflict that we're in here. I believe a couple of things about fear. One, people don't behave at their best when they're really afraid. And a politics that's driven by fear, which has defined much of American political discourse in the last couple of election cycles, and is certainly a huge factor in this current election cycle, has, I think, potentially deadly outcomes. And so, on one hand, fear is a very dangerous mechanism for driving social change. On the other hand, there are a lot of good reasons to be afraid in the world today. And I think that if we only respond to people's fear by saying, lo lefachek klal, don't be afraid, there's nothing to be afraid of, so then we're living in a fantasy. Right? The world is a very dangerous place. Here, we live in a very dangerous neighborhood. It's very important for us to be aware of what real threats are. And I want to just bring us to this incredibly powerful and beautiful, the powerful and beautiful words that were spoken by the man who owned the cafe in Paris that was one of the targets of the attacks in November, who I don't know if you remember, but there was a story afterwards. He lost his wife in this attack. She was murdered and died in his arms. And and a couple of days after the attacks, he led a walk through their neighborhood holding a white rose in his hand. And he said the following words. He said, "You have taken from me the most beautiful thing that I have in the world, this person who I love so deeply, who is the mother of our 18-month-old child. And now our child will grow up without a mother, and I will grow up without my great love. And he said, "You've taken so much from me, I will not also allow you to take my heart. So I am both afraid and aware of the danger, but also I choose to live with love." And I think about this man and what kind of courage that took. And this was, by the way, a cafe that was defined by overcoming differences. And people would gather in this place to drink wine, Muslims and Jews and Christians and black people and white people and brown people, people of all different faiths and traditions and backgrounds would come together in this place in the most Parisian way to drink wine and talk politics and talk about art. And he said, "We're going to open the restaurant again. We're cleaning up and we're opening the cafe and we continue to lead with love." So while I think the world is an incredibly scary place, I also think really the only choice that we have today is to lead with love. With that, I thank you all, and I hope our paths cross again soon. Send you great blessings on all of your journeys.